All right. I think we can move on to our third talk of this afternoon session. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Goldman from the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he's a professor in the physics department. And in his lab, he takes a robo-physical approach to discover principles of effective interaction between robots and environment. So, Dan, welcome. The floor is yours.
Everybody hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you and I
Okay.
can see the slides.
All right. Well, oops. Thank you all for having me here. This has been a lot of fun to hear these talks and get inspired. I'm going to go some distance in telling you today some relatively recent efforts in our group on what I'll call towards terradynamically task-capable swarms. Of course, you've seen and seen today that there are excellent examples in real world of aerial swarms or dynamically capable swarms, including real and artificial, hydrodynamically capable swarms, which have been noted to real and artificial, and even what I'll call terradynamically capable swarms, real and artificial. And my group has been interested in, actually, I guess we didn't call it swarms when we started working on, but kind of champion terradynamic swarmers, ants, like Spring just talked about, but these are a species of ant called fire ants, which are a pest in this part of the country. And if you crack open a fire ant mound, these are champion terradynamic swarmers. They live and construct in incredibly complex nests in groups of thousands to millions of small ants, each presumably having no idea about the global desires of the collective, whatever they may be. My group in the last few years, last 10 years, I'd say, has spent a lot of time studying this particular species because they're so impressive, including aspects of, thing is not clicking, I don't know, including aspects, I don't know why my mouse is not clicking with things. Okay, it's better. Including aspects of, well, this is a picture from Walter Chinkel's group in which makes casts of nests which extend up to 1 meter deep, including vertical shafts and horizontal chambers. And we've sort of taken a laboratory approach to study how these superorganisms complete tasks like creating nests, for example, in quasi 2D chambers, how they construct these networks of tunnels. From an individual perspective, how ants can grab and manipulate particles of sand and other soil. In this case, they're manipulating rather large particles and doing so not just via mandible, but via beautiful coordination of limbs, antennae, and mandible to lift particles. We've looked quite a bit at how they move within tunnels, which is not always a beautifully smooth process, but they tend to create narrow tunnels which they can crawl up and down at multiple body lengths a second, often falling and slipping. And we've also studied the collective excavation dynamics. How does a group of, say, 30 ants, which we know the individuals by painting their abdomens, how do they sequence the workforce in these crowded and confined conditions? We've also looked at traffic flow in tunnels. This has led to particularly these two topics, this has led to what I'll call a robo-physical collective swarm, which is a group of autonomous robots which can excavate a collection of granular material, in this case, little plastic particles with loose magnets inside, which form a cohesive sand-like mimic. Individuals desire to perform a task, which is excavation. The collective also desires to perform a task, but the desires of the individual get in the way of the desires of the collective. You could see by this sort of jamming. What we discovered was that by studying the ants is that the secret is essentially to be lazy and give up easily. And this strategy, when implemented in the robots, collectively, without central command and control, allows a group of robots, we have relatively few here, but can be expanded, to excavate effectively a cohesive environment in a relatively confined situation. And in recent months and years, we've been studying how such strategies can be learned by only local interactions. Okay, but we've been studying these for some years, and I've been dissatisfied because our robots basically are pterodynamically capable if you consider that pterodynamics is flat laboratory ground, which hardly looks like the real pterodynamic world. And so I had a postdoc, it was just 2D, how do we go to 3D in more complex environments? I had a postdoc who got excited about this and said, Yasmin Azkan-Iden, said she can use legs and some of the principles we've learned by studying legged systems to bring pterodynamic swarms into the real world. And this is a paper, which is soon to appear, in which she created this rather, I think, cool set of robots, which can be formed into a long chain and readily assembled and disassembled with a cool little magnet mechanism. Forward this along. Individually in little quadrupeds with a clever, low-cost, cheap, pretty battery, nice, friendly mechanism, can walk in a diagonal gait. They have a little flexible tail, which actually aids in pterodynamic effectiveness. Directionally flexible limbs, this is supposed to be limbs, which aid in pterodynamic pterodynamic effectiveness by, as a limb crosses an obstacle, it complies as it's being pushed against the direction of motion, but is rigid in the other direction and allows it to go through. So these sort of minimal elements turn out to create a reasonably effective set of robots that can clamber around in kind of relatively complex terrain like leaf litter and debris, and not just as individuals, but as joined collectives. And one of the cool things, if you read this paper, Yasmin's discovered and sort of understood the principles by when robots are better formed as individuals or as a collective sort of centipede like robot, for example, in gap crossing. She also discovered that these robots can, when in their kind of centipede form, in their myriapod form, can traverse open loop, pretty complex terrain, which was surprising to us. And finally, they're becoming reasonably proficient at obstacle transport in relatively complex environments. I saw Spring's beautiful work talking about object transport. Here, in fact, the goal is to transport through a relatively rugose terrain. And it turns out by signaling to each other, these robots can join into multi-legged systems to aid transport. Okay. But again, this requires a reasonable amount of ordering. Are there other ways to pterodynamically swarm? And that basically is what I want to tell you most about in my short time today. Been inspired for years by kind of what I'll call a task-capable amorphous pterodynamic swarm. And this would be Dictyostelium, a slime mold. Whoa, I don't know why that just went. These slime molds are, of course, composed of single cells, individual amoeba, which, as studied by Bonner for many years, can form into slugs, which can locomote collectively, and also can form interesting structures in their life cycle called fruiting bodies, which are basically kind of create sort of interesting solid-like structures and shapes on demand. So I've been curious how one could kind of recapitulate this in robots and potentially learn biological principles on the way. And again, the more fanciful version of this is I had sort of said, boy, what if we could, from the old Spider-Man 3 movie, create a robot, which was basically just a bunch of sand grains, and those sand grains could come together to form structures like, this person, the Sandman here. And the question is, what kind of macroscopic states behaviors of a so-called granular material, an active granular material, can we achieve when particles become relatively smart, neighbor aware, etc.? And how would one program such an ensemble of uncoordinated, distributed, stochastically interacting, minimally computing elements? Well, we haven't made it to the Sandman. In fact, we've been taking baby steps. And then some of the baby steps actually have been through a kind of nice interaction with two computer scientists, Dana Randall and Andrea Riccia. And in fact, we had a paper this year in which we used an idea that's inspired by a provable transition in a lattice model developed by these two people. We could leverage phase changes to program a minimally complex robot swarm to aggregate based on local desires of the lattice elements to be near or away from neighbors. We realized this in what we call buzzing, organizing, behaving robots, or BobBots. These were named to honor a pioneer in granular material, Bob Behringer, who was interested in stress properties of connected groups of grains. And this is a DEM simulation, multi-body simulation. And I only show that here because you can see these things have a natural dynamic of kind of circling around. And these four little dots here are loose magnets at the periphery, so that when robots kind of collide, they always can find a way to attract each other. So they want to kind of be near each other. That's for a low magnet strength. If I increase the size of the magnet, the loose magnet in the little housing, up to a certain amount, we find that the number of robots that are in the characteristic cluster increases monotonically and then plateaus. So for sufficiently large magnets, we can then watch a group of robots, of BobBots, kind of aggregate and then kind of develop a cool and beautiful dynamics on their own. Okay, cool. We've solved the aggregation problem with no brain power and no, these are about as dumb a robot you can imagine. They're purely analog. One of the cool things we discovered is that they have emergent transport properties. So if I have a low magnet strength group of BobBots and I put an impurity in the environment, like this block here, they can kind of come together and form smaller clusters and kind of shove this object around a little bit. But above the aggregation transition, they can form relatively large clusters. Again, they have no idea that they're doing this. And those large clusters actually can serve a purpose and transport objects out of the environment with no programming to transport anything. So we think this is kind of interesting. However, this is still just a 2D in a flatland world. Can we go to 3D to kind of make our more amorphous type swarms leveraging physics principles? Well, this is some of our efforts towards that, and it goes back actually to some work we did with David Hu years back, in which David studied fire ant rafts and towers. And the interesting thing about fire ants, when they're not in the ground, they basically form rafts which can float on water, which allow them to live and reestablish the colony when they can find dry land again. We did sort of a minimal physics study of, we'll call it entangling granular material, studying U-shaped particles or staples, and found that, in fact, U-shaped particles, not ants, can form nice solid structures on demand. We just sort of pour them into a container. And the interesting thing was that the collapse timescale, if I shake this pile, is quite sensitive in a certain region to the length over width of this staple. So if I had a way to modulate the length to width of this thing, I would be able to create a structure which is solid, and then I could make it kind of flow away to a fluid. Okay, well, we haven't gotten there yet, but we developed what we called smart active particles, or smarticles, which were supposed to be U-shaped particles who can change their U-ness on demand. Now, the staples, as I told you, the parameter was the length to width of the arms. We couldn't figure out a good way to do that, to shrink and grow arms, so we basically made the arms such that they could flap a little bit. Okay, well, it turns out that these smarticles can do interesting things by playing tones to them, which prevents them from draining battery. We don't have to use radios. We can have them go to different static configurations. They can move a little bit. In fact, more than a little bit. They can crawl pretty effectively, and they can form sort of solid and gaseous like chains on demand. Okay, one discovery we made was that if we place a set of smarticles on the ground, one individual can't go anywhere because its arms don't touch the ground, but an ensemble of individuals, if enclosed in a ring, can basically diffuse around. So we have sort of a mobile collective despite individual immobility, which I think is an interesting concept, because now this really is an emergent property of the collective, which we can then potentially leverage. How do we leverage? Well, let me not show you data, it diffuses around. How do we leverage it? Well, we discovered just by accident that if one went dead and kind of went into a straight shape, this tended to bias the dynamics of the so-called supersmarticle, and it let it kind of wander off in one direction. We did this systematically, and it turns out that if I measure the average drift speed as a function of the mass ratio of the robot relative to the ring, one can either have this collective navigate towards or away from the inactive robot in the frame of in the rotated frame. And we had a little model, sort of a statistical model, which actually rationalized that. And so the theory is in red and the black is an experiment. So despite how complicated these flapping things look, it ends up sort of a statistical type model, does a good job of capturing it, with essentially no fitting parameters. Okay, well, what can one do with that? Well, the cool thing is that one can start to direct the super smarticle. A student made basically a system where if he shines a light on one of the robots, on the smarticles, it goes inactive and becomes straight. And if there's a robot behind it and it's occluded, that robot still goes. And this allows the student, Ross, to basically control the direction of this super smarticle with light. By sort of pointing out the smarticle he wants to be inactive, he can bias the thing. So it's an emergently locomotory capable robot, despite no robot having locomotor capabilities. And Todd Murphy's group helped us with control on this. This was sort of culminated in a story which was published last year, in which we discovered that this robot can essentially swarm endogenously towards a light source, with the cool bit being here that no one robot is actually capable of moving or deciding what which way to go. When a robot sees the light sufficiently bright, it basically freezes, and that can be different robots can freeze throughout the duration, and this then stochastically biases the robot towards the light source. Okay, well, where are we going with this? Well, and it turns out it's the same speed. Well, where we're going with this is now, as I said, I want to go into 3D, and we haven't gotten there in experiment, but we are doing it in simulation, where you basically can take our smarticles and you can play fun games like dump them into a container, put a stick inside that container, and then tell the smarticles to go from U-shape to straight back to U, and watch what happens. And what happens is, upon this one change of command, the thing basically turns itself into a sphere. Red indicates stress, and that sphere can support stresses and basically engulf this stick and latch onto it. So it could be potentially used to perform a task like grabbing an object. Okay, well, it turned out that we would have been playing with this and studying this, and a few years back, I happened to meet a new colleague at Georgia Tech, Professor Saad Bamla, who coordinated with Yasmin and showed us the wonders of a really task-capable amorphous swarm, and that is blackworm or mudworm blobs. These are little centimeter-long worms which live in shallow ponds as their natural habitat and form masses of blobs of hundreds to thousands. This is a mass of blobs. They are masters of entanglement and rapid disentanglement as they need. Here you can see them sort of entangling and coming up close. They form basically like a living material. Here's Yasmin holding 50,000 worms, which is all just a worm blob. And this worm blob is being subject to mechanical assaults, so they're staying together, but can disassemble when conditions are better. Turns out one of the tasks this worm blob is good at is protecting as many as possible. So if you take, this is 20 different replicates of 20 worms, or 11 replicates of 20 worms each, and you have them subject to desiccation, take them out of water, they'll basically form a little hemispherical blob. And it turns out that hemispherical blob has a final projected area, which is in accord with a theory which would say minimize your fluid loss through desiccation. So that's one task they do well. Another task they do well is they escape from hot regions. So we did a laboratory experiment where we have water and worms in the water and a hot plate and a cooler. And it's sort of an interesting story. If you shine light on the blob, on the worms, and the light is not too bright, they somehow feel, we'll say, safe, anthropomorphizing, and they go from the hot region to the cold region by kind of disentangling and swarming over here. If you shine a very bright light on them, they somehow don't feel safe, and the entire blob transports itself collectively away from the hot. Now, It turns out that you can measure the displacement of the blob as a function of time. This is its position, kind of center as a function of time. And for large numbers of worms, they move relatively slowly. For smaller numbers of worms, they move more rapidly. And you see that there's these sort of seemingly kind of interspersed jumps and periods of stasis. And in fact, this helped us kind of understand a rudimentary mechanism of how this blob, which presumably has no central coordination, can actually go from A to B. And here's a little blob moving. And what we discovered is that basically there's kind of, the worms come in sort of two flavors when they're subjected to a heat gradient. Those that are closest to the heat kind of curl up and coil, and that serves to lift the trailing side of the blob, whereas those closer to the cool side tend to reach out and scrape without coordination. So we hypothesized the blob movement is an unsynchronized collaboration among leading edge, elongating pullers, and trailing edge coil lifters. I only have a few more minutes. So to robo-physically model the worm blob, we implemented the key behaviors in our smarticles. Here's one. This would be our wiggler, which would, subject to light conditions, we're going to replace heat for light. Subject to low light conditions would wiggle, and subject to high light conditions would try to kind of crawl or scrape. And if they're intermediate light, they either go limp or they hold rigid. Now, it turns out that our first experiments, and this is what we do laboratory experiments, were a total failure. Our smarticle blob did not, in 2D, did not stay intact. Its integrity, they kind of just all spread out. And we realized that our U-shape, these chunky U-shapes that we made, were not sufficient to entangle in this stochastic environment to maintain integrity. So Yasmin kind of developed a little clever hooks and mesh network, which would allow them to entangle, but also allow them to disentangle just the right amount, which she had to tune. And when she did that, see if this will play, she was able to demonstrate. Come on. Oh no, why is it not playing? Oh, that's a shame. Oh, that's the movie you got to see. Ah, there we go. You could see that if she only lets the bottom robots wiggle, no movement. If she only lets this will come, the front robot crawl, no movement. But when she turns on the full control and lets the intermediate robots kind of act passively as binders, you will see that emergently, this thing will crawl towards the light as a unit in a very rudimentary demonstration of the principles of the living system. And here's a heat map, oops, which is not showing up. I don't know why. Anyway, one can then, the cool thing about the robots actually is then one can vary parameters. One can make all the robots crawl and measure their displacement in response to light. One can vary how fraction of the robots. And it turns out that the right mixture of flexible robots and active crawlers and active wigglers is important for the integrity of the blob. Okay, well, this all close. There's much more interesting to be done with the worms, which will help potentially inspire aerodynamically capable swarms. These worms are really good at finding food. Here they are started in a chamber in a little maze, and they sort of seem to send out a little scout. And once they'll start again, once the scouts kind of find the food, the rest of the blob basically follows along a good path towards the food. And from there, they can start to scrape up the food and bring it into their collective. And it's actually quite beautiful because we're finding that large bits of food require a blob so that, because individual worms can't eat very well on their own. And it has to be they have to manipulate the food inside to eat. They can also swarm in 3 dimensions, crawl around in cool ways. Anyway, they're just a wonderful system for potential inspiration for amorphous, aerodynamically capable swarms. Okay, so I told you a lot towards the aerodynamically cast-capable swarms. Legged swarms, we have some recent work showing how legged swarms can have both individual and collective capabilities in natural environments. We showed you a stochastically controlled robot made of robots, and then finally task-capable and flexible amorphous blobs. And with that, I'll call it quits and take any questions. Thanks.
Amazing, Dan. That was really cool. Thank you so much for that. We do have maybe a few minutes for questions. We can jump right in. I can see a few on Slido. So the first one is, looks like the smarticles need a lot of energy for locomotion. Where do you see this energy coming from when deployed on the field? So
Well,
maybe you
that's
can
actually
talk.
interesting. Yeah, it turns out they don't. It looks that way, but I'll just say anecdotally, we put a little lipo battery in them, and 3 days later they're still wiggling around and colliding with each other subject. And the reason is that it turns out the locomotor tasks aren't so brutal. And had we put radios in them, and we tried early on, Zigbee, Bluetooth, then that starts to suck the battery. But locomotor wise, they can go for days and days. And we have a whole series of papers. All this kind of 2D planar stuff was never what I was most interested in. We were interested in moving towards the 3D, but just through a random accident, and this is what I think is sort of fun about the robophysics approach, just for a random accident of putting one smarticle down on a table and letting another wiggle around next to it, we discovered some cool phenomena. But we wouldn't have been able to do that if we had drained the battery so quickly. So in early days, we had solar panels on them. We thought of wireless charging, but we've ended up not needing that. Now, going forward, of course, one needs some charging capabilities. And I imagine that there's increasingly cool ways to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, we do need more serendipity in robotics, I think, in robotics experiments. So actually, I had a question of my own, thinking about looking at the smarticle. So it was really cool to see that one robot could be used in so many different sort of experiments, showcasing so many different properties. And I was curious, like, as you start to do these behaviors, is there a pattern sort of emerging in terms of how you need to control them? Like you employ some logic for into the robots for every single experiment. But I was wondering, like, as you start to do more and more of them, do you start to see a pattern emerging of like a control algorithm, or is it still are these still sort of like isolated experiments?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think we're still in the early days of principles of these entangled collectives, right? I think that the key ingredient here is one of the problems I showed you with those little BobBot robots is that they need magnets to collect. And I sort of have some understanding of how magnets can keep you connected. The problem with magnets is that unconnecting, right? It requires maybe electromagnet or a mechanical thing like Yasmin did for her swarm robot. And that could be potentially energy ineffective. I like this sort of idea of entangled active systems, entangled swarms for function, but I think we're just missing at this stage principles, sort of physics principles of how solid is an entangled group of worm blobs if they entangle by a certain amount, and depending on the flexibility of the individuals, depending on how much they're pulling, and I suspect that as we kind of explore, and what I like is kind of going between the physics and the robotics. By making the things, we actually learn what we should be looking at, either in the physics or in the biology. So I would say that's a long way of saying that at this point, certainly biasing is important, but I would say that we're still in the early days of figuring out the properties of these things.
Got it. All right. I look forward to discussing more of that in the panel discussion. I think we can move on to our next talk. So thank you so much, Dan.
My pleasure.